Hi everyone, and welcome to this SIPRI webinar, Critical Minerals and Great Power Competition, Interactions and Implications. I'm really excited to get this started and to hear from our really distinguished panel of speakers, as I'm sure you all are. But I also thought to just start with a couple quite basic introductions, especially for any audience members that are joining us based on the topic, but might not be familiar with SIPRI. SIPRI was founded in 1966 in the midst of the Cold War by the Swedish Parliament as an independent and international institute to provide some factual foundations for understanding as well as contributing to global peace. Like any other organization, we've evolved to progressively look at the links also between sustainable development and global security, of which I think this conversation about critical and strategic minerals are increasingly becoming an important part of. I also want to give a shout out to MISTRA, which is the Swedish Foundation for Strategic Environmental Research. They are supporting this project as part of the 8th year of a major initiative and program called MISTRA Geopolitics. It's a wide consortium and research network and research program looking at the links between geopolitics and sustainable development. My name is Jai Zhao. I'm incredibly honored and very excited to moderate this webinar, due in almost entirely part to the fantastic set of speakers that we have today, both in terms of the diversity of their expertise, but also the depth of it. And I'll introduce each of the speakers as we go along. In terms of housekeeping, just the basic format of this webinar is around speaker presentations of around 10-15 minutes each, followed then by reflections and a discussant through our project partner, Andre, based at Lund University. We'll then have a moderated conversation among all the panelists and speakers, and then open it up for Q&A. I believe you can write in your questions all throughout the webinar. So please do use the Q&A box and we'll try to get answers to your questions. Just a little bit to set the stage, maybe explain a little bit of the webinar's framing and its focus on so-called great power competition, both the strategies of individual states and polities, as well as the global implications. Obviously, we're not going to be able to do very deep dives into, what are incredibly complex market dynamics and supply chains and technical developments that, for any one mineral category would be enough for, several days of seminars, I'm sure. But at the political level, at least, we do have progressively better defined policy strategies, especially among the US and the EU and partner states, with strategies and targets and tools to achieve so-called critical mineral security. And many of the speakers will get to that today. But critical or strategic mineral security is also embedded in several much fuzzier concepts and targets and imperatives, anything from resource security in general to technological or digital sovereignty, strategic autonomy, economic security, national security, all the way up to, the biggest, fuzzy concept of them all, the international order, both political and economic. And as these kind of projects and imperatives and concepts and stakes get more fuzzy, they also get somehow higher. And I think critical minerals security is really at the vanguard of sort of trying to define how we're organizing our economic system, but also our political values, how we're understanding integration and the relationship between economic integration and peace. All of these things are undergoing fundamental rethinks. And so I think it really is beholden on all of us to also understand the political drivers, the political foundations, even if something as concrete as minerals. So with that, we'll get started with the first speaker, Marina Zhang at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's an associate professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute and the author of several books. Before joining UTS, she held positions at the University of New South Wales and Tsinghua University. I'm very excited to hear from her. She writes across the board on several issues around supply chains, technology, geopolitics. And I know she's going to be great. So please go ahead, Marina.
Thank you, Jia. It's a great honor to join you and join all the panelists today to share some of my thoughts. Let me just try to find my screen. All right, can you see it? Can you see? Okay. Well, I started this project with two of my colleagues and two of my actually mentors. We're working on a project that is called Tech Rivalry between the US and China. And we covered two areas. One is semiconductors and AI. That's sort of the area where both countries, especially the US, using a containment strategy and try to establish and how to say, is not established, try to protect its technological supremacy. And China is at the mercy of the US-led allies in terms of technological supplies. And China was determined to develop its own indigenous technologies, and is catching up, but the distance is still quite far away. The other area is the topic of today's webinar. And we found actually the game actually is totally different from the AI and semiconductors, that's critical minerals. So in our study, we find China actually holds quite distinctive advantages, especially the cost advantages across the entire supply chain of critical minerals. Not just one element, we're talking about most critical minerals used in renewable technology, renewable energy technologies, and including EV and solar panels and so on. So in this game we find, well, it's different from the first category I just mentioned, semiconductors, AI, because critical minerals, the most important use is actually to helping the human beings to fight against climate change. And in this area, our argument is collaboration is perhaps more important than direct confrontation and competition. So, so as I said, a new battlefield in the US-China tech rivalry. And so I think I mentioned this one, and I just start from the next one. That is why critical minerals are so important. As I mentioned, components of clean energy transition, and we're talking about lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite, and rare earth elements. In fact, rare earth elements, that's one of the few areas where China can hold leverage against the US, because China controls, for some heavy rare earth elements, China holds almost 90% of the processing capabilities. So the challenges in this game is, well, we're talking about resource scarcity. But when we're talking about resource scarcity, we have to differentiate the resources. That means technological resources or the mineral resources. As you perhaps all know, and I guess most of my panelists, co-panelists today will agree with me. For most of those minerals, actually, naturally, they're not scarce. They're just not evenly distributed across the world. But the critical and scarce resources actually are supply chains, especially the midstream processing and production capabilities. So that is the area where all the geopolitical great power competitions are concentrating on right now. So they try to control the supply chains from upstream to downstream. So that's the center of the game. So the challenges in this game is, apart from the scarcity, is long supply chains. and not just the long, but also multi-layered. And most of them actually are very opaque. So you will not be able to see all your, if you let's say for mineral producer, and you cannot see the entire supply chains. Many elements, many layers actually invisible. That involves obviously even more complex issues, including environmental damaging initiatives and even some activities actually violating human rights and so on. And another one is significant lead time from discovery to production. Generally, depending on the different element, we're talking about 10 to 15 years. So, but on the other hand, we're facing a time pressure. That is, we're fighting against climate change. And we're talking about an issue that is related to everybody's survival in the long run. So obviously, critical minerals are not the only answer to renewable and clean energy transition, but is one of them so far. So the center of this great power competition is on the supply chains of critical minerals. So there are two options. Before I talk about two options, let's talk about the U.S. strategies. U.S. strategies obviously is to de-risk or decoupling from China's supply chains, because the common the consensus now is China is holding too higher a percentage of critical mineral processing capabilities. So for example, graphite, China holds maybe 80%, lithium 60%, and in the worst case scenario of confrontations between the U.S. and China, and obviously these supply chains controlled by one single source, will face very severe challenges of disruptions. So therefore, to diverse supply chains is a consensus reached by not just the US and by EU countries. And China's response is, China has done this. China's advantages is not just built overnight. It's being built for, in the case of rare earths, that's over 20 years and more. In other critical minerals, especially lithium, that's 15 years. So China's response is to maintain its advantages, because, as I said, this is the area where China holds a very strong leverage against the US-led allies in the global supply chain. And China has also invested in multiple mine sites globally. So this complete competition of global supply chains is how to say, there are a lot of diverse interests involved. So for example, the US is leading this decoupling or de-risking supply chain. So that is, if we can have independent ones without China's involvement, that would be great. And the other countries on the value chain, including industrialized countries, largely as the buyers or the users of critical minerals, and some of the suppliers that including Australian and other mineral-rich countries, and Europe as both to a smaller extent. Actually, they all have their own different agendas. They have their own different economic, technological, military interests. So it's actually quite hard to realize the agendas set by the US-led mineral security partnership. So therefore China plus one strategy is sort of more realistic option. So the very important question, especially as a for human being as a whole, is to consider which option actually will help us realize sustainability goals. That means, well, if we think about why critical minerals as a whole has become a strategic asset for the competition between the great powers, the reason is we're talking about fighting climate change. We're talking about clean energy transitions. And that's why US has introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, and European Union has also set up similar kind of policies. But if all countries engage in this kind of subsidies arms race, what are the consequences? Are we really providing a realistic solution to supply chain vulnerabilities? Or we're just fighting, we're just giving up economic integration and supply chain efficiencies for the sake of national security? And what national securities intel for each country? Those questions actually are not something I can answer. But from an innovation perspective, I can say, well, I do research in supply chains, and to increase resilience or even the security of supply chains, I mean, building redundancy is not the only answer. And a resilient supply chains means, well, a supply chain can restore and external shocks. So that's, I think, what the global community should work together to achieve. So, for example, a diversifying supply chain, supply source is one option. Another one is a global, multilateral collaborations. And by doing so, enhancing supply chain transparency and sustainability should be the goal we're after. So the question is collaboration versus decoupling. So arguments for collaboration and obviously economic rationalism favors integrated supply chains, and also cooperation can enhance innovation and innovation efficiencies and the competitiveness of the supply chains. And of course, they can accelerate clean energy transition if that is a common goal we're working towards. And challenges of decoupling, as I mentioned earlier, different stakeholders, different countries on the entire critical minerals supply chains, from upstream mine extractions and productions to midstream processing, refining, to downstream applications. Different countries have different interests to protect, and to help to let all those people, all those countries, to sit together, to work together on the unified agenda is actually quite challenging. And the second challenge, of course, is increased costs and inefficiency. By building redundancy, obviously that means, well, you have to invest more money in not just mining, but also investing in technologies, because during the current geopolitical environment, China's investment, especially in critical minerals in mining sectors, has received very strict scrutiny. What does that mean? That means, well, Chinese technologies may not be adopted by many countries in the mineral security partnership countries, and for those countries, put them together, and of course they have very strong technological innovation capabilities, and given them time, they will reinvent the wheels. But that means, well, we potentially will hinder global progress on clean energy transition. So those are the arguments for both sides. And then, of course, one thing we have to put at the center of the argument, that is huge environmental costs. Doesn't matter what element you're talking about, rare earths, lithium. I mean, lithium, and I use Australian as example because Australian's lithium is really in hard rocks, right? That means you have to extract the surface of the ground and get the rocks out, and that will cause environmental damage, not just in the surface ground damage, but also water pollutions and a lot of potential damages. If I share China's experience, China's critical mineral process industry started with very strong government subsidies and government support to encouraging over exploitation of the mines, and that caused enormous environmental damages. And in the past 5 to 10 years, China has shifted the policy support on critical minerals, including rare earths, that is technological innovation driven. So China is investing, has put a lot of effort on mitigating environmental impact through cleaner technologies and waste management technologies and the recycling technologies. So if we put in the best case scenario, and put aside all ideological differences aside, I mean, China's technological leadership should make a contribution to the global agenda fighting against the climate change. So the way forward, role of multilateral institutions, promoting diversified and resilient supply chains, and China Plus One strategy still is a realistic solution. And in fact, a few recent reports from EU actually acknowledge this solution. And future directions balancing national security concerns with global sustainability goals. That is really important. And developing comprehensive policies that support both competition and collaboration. So I totally agree. In the paper I wrote with my co-authors, as I said at the beginning of the US-China tech rivalry, in the semiconductors, AI, most of those technologies have applications in weaponry systems, in defense systems. I totally agree. More cautious approach should be used to protect national security. But critical minerals, the majority use of critical minerals are for clean energy transition. And in this area, collaboration should prioritize over competition and confrontation. So key takeaways: critical minerals are essential for the clean energy transition and are unfortunately at the center of great power competition. And collaborative strategies can enhance global supply chain resilience and sustainability. That is what we should go. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion with you.
Thank you so much, Marina. Now we'll talk and we'll turn to Florian, who is a research fellow in international affairs and science and technology at the Arctic University of Norway. He's an associate fellow at the Russia-Eurasia Center, also of the French Institute of International Relations, IFRI. I know Florian holds a really unique and extremely timely set of expertise on Russia's mineral sector, Arctic development strategies, and political economy more generally. I think it's a great follow-up to Marina's intervention because compared to a sector where, you know, everybody talks about decoupling and de-risking in relation to China, in the case of Russia, that is an active reality. So I really look forward to Florian, your presentation.
Thank you, Jet. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to share my presentation. So of course, when we talk about this global critical minerals competition, Russia is not, of course, the big stakeholder in the room, because it's, of course, now when we talk about this topic, it's more, of course, this global competition between the US and China, and of course the European Union, which at least try to be a stakeholder, but Russia has somehow kind of interesting assets in terms of mineral potential, and the ongoing geopolitical shift, of course, bring Russia at a certain position in which it will be interesting to discuss, and I will try to dwell into this this question. So first of all, it's interesting that Russia, for obvious reason, Russia is a vast land territory, and then in terms of geological potential is quite huge. But an interesting aspect, as you can see on this presentation, Russia accepts diamonds, in which Russia has a prominent position in terms of natural diamond production. The Russia doesn't have, for example, a mono-mineral strong production like Chile with copper, or the RDC with cobalt. It has a more diverse capabilities and wealth in terms of resources, and it put Russia in different strategic critical mineral area, such cobalt, which is the second producer player with 4%, as well with potassium, which is very important for fertilizer production and then agriculture, nickel production, titanium production, uranium. So you have a complete, I would say, Mendeleev periodic table that Russia can mobilize, and it's the biggest asset. And associated with this potential, you have various number of companies, Russian companies, which, depending, of course, the sector, has been specialized. Arosa is the biggest diamond producer. You have Nickel, which is producing both nickel and copper. Rosatom, which is specialized in uranium, but now is in discussion, close discussion, and with Nornickel to develop lithium deposit in Russia. So you have this this state of strong position on various metals and minerals, with key mining companies, Russian mining companies. And this situation, of course, it's interesting to come back to the when actually this mining sector really started. Of course, it started during the Soviet times, and during the Stalin plan development during the 30s. And interestingly, today you have still some deposit that's still working from this time, especially if we talk about Norilsk nickel, which they are the most the production area. It's located in Norilsk, in up north in Russia, in the Arctic region. We started at the mid of 1930s, and there are this deposit of nickel and copper are still active. And the thing is, the situation now, it's we have still this Soviet operating infrastructure. So what we are seeing until today, it's the legacy of this Soviet industrialization, mining industrialization. And of course, during the last 2 decades, since the mining industrial landscape in Russia, it's very fragmented, really diverse, and very privatized. Most of the mining companies are privatized. And of course, they have this kind of obligation to look after their benefits and their productivity, and of course, looking after the cost of the mining production. So you have some companies like Norilsk Nickel try to modernize their production infrastructure. So you are in this landscape, important Russian mining actors on the global stage, and you have this modernization process that has been developed, but they are still facing some critical issue, which the situation since February 22 just actually accelerate this accelerate these issues, these problems. First is, of course, the question of infrastructure deficiencies, because they found new deposits in different minerals like lithium, as I mentioned, but as well copper, even coal, because they even extract their Russia is an important coal producer as well. But the thing to exploit all these potential geological deposits, they need infrastructure, road infrastructure, port infrastructure, railway infrastructure, and this is a big one of the big issue. The second one, and the ongoing context with these sanctions and geopolitical tension, there is a lack of investment to accomplish such development. And of course, the war as well accelerate this problem with human resources, since the war mobilized some for the war. Some people, especially young people, just left the country, and then you have the industrial, and I will come back to that point. In Russia now, the industrial landscape, it's really focused on the defense industry. And now we have a new Ministry of Defense, Belousov, which will accelerate the process of the militarization of the Russian industry. So this question of human resource, of course, will remain a critical issue. And one last interesting and important dimension, it's the climate change impact on the Russian territory, because there is 60% of the Russian territories is laying on permafrost. And you look a geological map and you put the geological potential of Russia and the permafrost area, most of this, they are laying on each other. It's in a way you find this mineral potential in this permafrost area, which actually is thawing, and of course will create difficulties, major difficulties to build infrastructure, and of course to maintain this infrastructure with such unstable areas. And of course, we are now in this very specific geopolitical situation in which Russia is under pressure with these Western systemic sanctions. And of course, most of the sanctions have been concentrated and for the last 10 years on gas and oil production, exportation. But in the mining sector, at the beginning of the war in 2022, it was not directly targeted, but due to the systemic dimension of these sanctions, it has been affected, of course, by these sanctions. But in the course of the last year, we saw an increasing pressure on over the Russian mining sector, and for example, interesting example, for a long time, the European Union was very reluctant to put a ban against the diamond, Russian diamond extraction, since for Belgium it was something really important for its business. But finally, earlier this year, they put a ban on non-industrial diamonds, because diamonds have a kind of importance for industrial application. Also, important development happened 2 months ago when the US and the British governments decide to put a ban on to trade new aluminium, copper, and nickel that has been produced from starting April 13, 2024. There is no longer a possibility to trade those 3 critical minerals. But of course, it has been stated that the ongoing existing stock in this market within the London Metal Exchange and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, it can be still trade. The reason is to avoid a strong market instability on price on these key minerals. And we already seen that regarding copper, there is a lot of pressure regarding the copper price, since there is an increasing demand and there is not enough offer on the market, because they need to open new copper mine. So the Western countries try to manage the sanctions regarding mining activities led by Russia. But Russia, of course, try to limit. Is trying to limit to in a way circumvent its the effect of the sanctions by finding new customers. And of course, in this landscape, India and China emerge as a key market to export these different critical minerals. And regarding the China-Russia, of course, China is when it comes to critical minerals is a very structural player on this segment. And what we see since the last 2 years, it's an increasing trade exchange between China and Russia, and Russia particularly increase its exportation not only of oil or gas, but as well on critical minerals. And last year, the trade between the 2 countries just reached this important amount of $240 billion USD dollars in 2023. So and so you have this growing economic partnership in this landscape. It's the same for the Russian iron ore that has been increasing the export toward the Chinese market, and even titanium, which there is ongoing common project, because of course one of the key, as I mentioned, in the more critical dimension for the Russian mining industry, there is a lack of investment, and China on some key project can be an interesting partner for investing. So you have this titanium deposit in the Russian Arctic region, and interesting development happened a few weeks ago. Due to the consequence of these Western sanctions, Norilsk Nickel, which was actually modernizing some production processing units in Norilsk, decided in fact to move some copper smelting unit to China. So we have this growing somehow industrial integration between China and Russia, in which Russia become a strong support to the Chinese industrial needs. So that is an interesting trend that the ongoing geopolitical development is offering to us. And one interesting project development that has been started in last September, it's the Udokan copper mine, which is located around 300 kilometers away from China. It is in the Far East, Russian Far East. This important, quite significant copper deposit actually was already known for over 70 years, 75 years. But of course, at that time, it was difficult due to the lack of some technology to explore this field. The question, of course, of infrastructure. But finally, this project has been developed, and now the project is able to will in the coming years able to produce about 150,000 tons of copper per year. And it is of course all this copper is it will be exported to China, which it will be the almost exclusive export market. Which the question with this project, it seems now that Russia, in a way, will just produce the raw materials, extract from its deposit, and then send it straight to China, in which it can process it for producing it. So and then of course get from this copper the high value of the product. So the question with this project, it's the question of the Russian position in this in mining value chain into the future, because until now Russia has some sort of interesting industrial assets on specific minerals like uranium, but the question will remain what the impact of the sanction on this. And it's interesting to open the scope of the Russian strategy when it comes to the geopolitical ambitions, when it comes to the Russian mining industry. And one key interesting example, it's the African case that the Russian diplomacy has developed in recent years. And one interesting thing, it's the Russia use mainly this mercenary group, Wagner group, which now is under supervision of the Russian Ministry of Defense, to offer some package to some African regime in which we offer you security for your regime, but in exchange, we get some key natural resources that will be useful for the Russian regime. And one of the things, the war started in 2022. The gold became something critical, because gold helped the Russian government to, of course, funnel money and bypass this Western financial sanctions. between the beginning of the war and then the end of 2023, it is to suppose that Russia succeed to earn about 2.5 US dollars from trading this gold from Africa. And actually, there is 3 countries, the Central Africa Republic, Sudan, and Mali. And this is, of course, important for Russia in a way to circumvent these sanctions, and these minerals should be seen as a way of monetary value, not for a specific critical minerals for industrial value. It's specifically for money. Because they need it with all this impact with this Western sanctions. And interesting development from beginning of June, but it has been so far denied by both companies. But they had some rumors regarding possible negotiations between Rosatom and Orano, which is uranium French producer company, to buy some uranium asset in Niger, because now we know that Russia is from now on implemented in this key uranium producer country. So to conclude, I have some global thought that, of course, we could discuss. It's on the middle and long term, the ability to Russia to be enough resilient regarding these sanctions, the capability to maintain its production capabilities, and of course, with this reorganization within the Russian industrial landscape, it is important that now critical minerals in Russia, of course, you have this official discourse regarding clean energy technology, but my guess it's this critical minerals we have a strong importance for the Russian defense industry. So it is likely that all the deposit that the Russia will prioritize, it will be connected to this defense industry. So it's for weapons mostly. And the other aspect interesting, it's the future Russian mining project in terms of exploitation. It is likely that Russia, now decoupling from the West, is likely to be connected even more with Asian powerhouses and becoming some sort of critical minerals hub for them. So thank you. That will be my
Thank you,
conclusion.
Florian. Thanks for that really fascinating overview and intervention. We'll come back to some of these points, hopefully. Next, we have Cullen Hendricks, who's a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, but I think also wears many hats and has quite a few affiliations, including at the Center for Climate and Security and the Colorado School of Mines. I always get my English idioms mixed up, but I understand he's a kind of a perfect storm in the best way of all things kind of sustainable development, markets, but also security and geopolitics. Among the many things that he's written, he's also was a contributing author to the 2022 IPCC report, where he assessed the implications of climate change for threats to peace and human mobility. And he'll, I think, yes, be giving us a US perspective today.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu, for having me here. It's wonderful to be with the SIPRI crowd and my fellow panelists here today talking about an issue of such obvious globe-spanning importance. Thanks to Dr. Zhang's masterful overview in the first session, some of what I'm going to say may seem a little bit remedial, but I would like to build the case up sort of piece by piece from the building blocks to try and help place US critical mineral strategy in a broader strategic context. So thank you. So what's the state of play here currently? Well, I would say that that Dr. Zhang fairly characterized it as one in which supply chains for critical minerals and key downstream technologies like EV batteries, solar modules, et cetera, are overwhelmingly dominated by China. And I think it's important to recognize that this is not due to manna from heaven. This is not similar to the pivotal role that Saudi Arabia has played in fossil fuel energy markets, for instance, because of the absolute abundance of domestic resources. But it's actually due to China's now decades-long investment in industrial policy to promote its emergence as a green tech leader, and frankly, a leader in mineral processing more generally. National and economic security strategy, not just in the United States, but in all countries that field modern militaries, are predicated on critical mineral intensive advanced technologies, like particularly critical mineral hungry defense applications. Each of the Virginia class subs that the United States fields and that are going to be sent to Australia under the AUKUS agreements needs nearly 5 tons of them. And that also extends to semiconductor technologies that support artificial intelligence and quantum computing. You see an NVIDIA chip there. NVIDIA is now, I believe, worth $3 trillion, making it worth even more than Apple, just on the strength of the intellectual property that goes into the design of the chips, which NVIDIA does not even make themselves. They're also necessary for decarbonizing our economies, meaning that the scramble to secure critical minerals is also a scramble to develop and bring to market the technologies like these lithium iron phosphate batteries that you see here. And supply chains for these critical minerals and key downstream technologies are overly concentrated. And I think that you can make that argument on grounds that have nothing to do with national security or economic security. I think that we are one or maybe several natural disasters away from failures in key points in these supply chains, which is a broader argument for supply chain resilience and sustainability, I would say. The key role that these materials play in combating climate change, which of course is a global public bad, and in providing national security, which is a local public good, imply a national security rationale for diversifying these supply chains and de-risking them from China that challenges, I think, the lowest cost producer logic of free markets and trade. And circumstances where the social benefits vastly kind of supersede the private benefits to individuals or firms of getting into these industries and building them out in a robust way are precisely the circumstances that kind of cry out for government intervention. That has led the West, in particular the United States, to embrace industrial policy in a big way with 3 pieces of legislation that will likely be unlocking by the end of the day, somewhere on the order of $2 trillion in spending, and deficit spending at that. If I were offering these remarks 100 years from now, $2 trillion would still be a lot of money. The jury is still out, of course, but I think in my estimation, US green industrial policy is going to face some strong headwinds that I'll be talking about. This policy is welcome and necessary, but some key changes I think are needed. So US green industrial policy is built around 3 legislative pillars and a host of supporting regulatory decisions. The 3 laws are the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which opened resources for modernizing the US electrical grid and expanding EV charging networks to speed adoption. The CHIPS Act, which seeks to do the same for semiconductors, and also, or excuse me, I should say, it's intended to do something similar to what the IRA is doing for EVs, which is to build a made in America supply chain, to use the Biden administration's kind of preferred term here. This chart, which is compiled by my colleague at the Peterson Institute, Martin Trozempa, shows just how effective this spending has been at catalyzing investment in new manufacturing capacity for products ranging from EV batteries to semiconductors. The US is indeed experiencing a domestic manufacturing boom in the aftermath of the IRA and CHIPS Act. And the facilities that produce these leading edge technologies have accounted for about 80% of the overall growth in total manufacturing related construction coming out of the pandemic, with much of that investment not just coming from US firms, but also coming from Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, 3 major trade and security partners. Now, for the Biden administration, I think pulling investment from allies and trading partners to onshore production capacity is a feature. It's not a bug. It's encouraging US strategic partners in Asia and Europe to invest heavily in building their electric vehicles and mining for lithium in places like North America, as opposed to doing it elsewhere. But of course, politicians in Seoul and Berlin have constituents as well. And so the US, EU, and other advanced economies and democracies certainly, I think, have some very shared interest in de-risking these supply chains, especially for those materials that are mission critical for national security applications. But of course, they are also economic competitors in a certain sense. All things being equal, the US, Germany, and Korea would all want to see EV uptake surge around the world, but they all prefer that their particular national champions are the ones who are going to gain that market share, which implies they are, in a sense, competing for adequate mineral inputs. So US industrial policy, I think here, in some senses, is driving a small wedge between the United States and its allies. And that's a wedge that could become important, as the United States will definitely need allies in order to address China's rising ambitions and Russian aggression. Now, the future of these supply chains, because of this boom in construction, may be made in America, but it's unlikely to be mined here for reasons ranging to the long lead times that were alluded to by Dr. Zhang in the mining industry, to reasons related to the domestic regulatory environment. The United States, at least if you buy the International Energy Agency's analysis, the United States is not going to become a significant miner of these minerals. This is looking at anticipated market share for these key energy transition minerals in the IEA's base case. The colors mean a lot of different things depending on the particular commodity at hand. All I need to do to, I think, really make the case is just point out that this is the share of total critical mineral production. It's in rare earths because of their defense applications that is likely to be mined in the United States by 2040. So this implies that the United States is going to have to go outward to source these materials. It may be able to onshore processing of these materials, but it is going to have to look outside US borders to source ore. And in doing so, it's going to be confronting the fact that Chinese firms, aided significantly by the Chinese state, have a significant first mover advantage in locking up access to particular resources. So the future may be assembled in America of our green energy transition, but it's not going to be mined here, which means that trade is going to remain important. So where are these minerals going to come from? Well, this gets into, I think, some of the foibles of US critical mineral policy. In order to access the tax credits that are, I think, the centerpiece of the Inflation Reduction Act and stimulate a big increase in EV and EV battery production, these materials actually, by stipulation of the legislation, have to be produced either in the United States or a country with which it has a free trade agreement, including the limited critical minerals agreement that the United States and Japan negotiated in 2023. Now, this chart here on the right shows you the percentage of global production in 2023 by the United States and its free trade agreement partners for key battery minerals. The outlook for lithium is relatively positive. Thank you, Australia. Thank you, Chile. But for others, it's pretty dire. For nickel, cobalt, and graphite, the shares are all below 10%. For graphite, it's 2%. Other advanced economies like Japan, Korea, and most of the economies in the European Union add only small shares of mine capacity. So a solution based on trading with kind of like-minded advanced economies is probably not going to work. This is not something that, say, the NATO alliance can take care of in-house. The United States is not going to be able to reshore its way to critical mineral supply chain resilience or count on its allies in Asia or Europe to make up the difference. And I think even if it eventually could, these long lead times that Dr. Zhang alluded to mean that this capacity is going to be the slowest to come online, if it comes online at all. And because battery technology is always advancing and the materials that are needed for these EV batteries are constantly changing, miners with multi-decadal timescales for thinking about their investments are being asked to hit, I think, a very difficult moving target, especially if all of that is going to be funded out of their own resources, which is, of course, implies the role for subsidies. I think it's important to note here, though, that and this is, I think, a criticism of the way this entire discussion is framed, is that in the pursuit of a de-risking strategy, I think that the rhetorical framing implies that you are eliminating risk from supply chains. That is not what I think is going to occur. De-risking implies a lessening of political risk, but the US strategy, because it's not going to be able to source from other advanced economies and allies, and because China has a first mover advantage in the very, very, very mineral rich middle income countries, particularly places like Indonesia, for instance, it's pushing the United States further in the direction of looking for resources in frontier or kind of peripheral suppliers in international markets. And those places, those countries that are going to be providing these raw materials have their own domestic political economies as well. I think the circumstances in DRC are relatively well and widely understood. I think graphite gives us a kind of a current window into this. So as you saw, the United States and its allies only produce about 2%, its free trade agreement partners only produce about 2% of global graphite supplies. And this is really starting to bite because in late 2023, China announced export restrictions on graphite that fell heavily on US importers and Japanese importers because of their participation in what Dr. Zhang alluded to in terms of trying to wall off China from having access to the latest generation semiconductor technology. And this has pushed the United States to rely on supply chains that originate for graphite in East Africa, and in particular to pin a lot of hopes on a company, Syrah Resources, which has received relatively significant funding from the Department of Energy to establish a processing facility for graphite in Louisiana in the United States. And so this sounds great. Syrah is able to advertise the fact that they have the only graphite supply chain from mine to the processing of the active anode material that is completely outside of China. The challenge is that in order to access those resources and have a feedstock for the processing facility, Syrah is relying on their mine in Balama, which is located in the Cabo Delgado region. And normally at this point, I would have to explain to an economics audience why that might be problematic. For a SIPRI audience, I think it may be more manifestly obvious, and that is that for at least the last 5 or 6 years, the Mozambican government, along with help from Rwandan forces and South African Development Community forces, has been fighting a vicious counterinsurgency in the Cabo Delgado region that at times has forced Syrah's mine to close. So this is not necessarily de-risking so much as it is substituting a different type of political risk. And I think that that's a challenge that we can talk about in our Q&A. And in my last minute here, I just want to make mention of the fact that one thing we haven't talked about is how likely these dynamics are to lead to a bout with the resource curse. And my general take on this is that the most pernicious mechanisms by which the resource curse operates are not necessarily operative here. My read of the resource curse literature and the pernicious effects of oil and natural gas for things like democracy, respect for human rights, et cetera, and according to some, economic growth, has to do with how much rent they generate. That is supernormal profits relative to the costs of bringing a good to market, or in this case, the cost of extraction. And this is a very indirect indicator, which is exports per capita, but I think that you will see that petroleum and liquefied natural gas, the table is the #1 exporter of these, the countries here are the #1 exporter in 2022. You'll see that petroleum and liquefied natural gas are sort of in a category of their own in terms of their potential to generate these massive windfall profits that governments that can then reinvest in repression or accommodative kind of practices vis-a-vis their populations, which helps explain why oil-rich countries are some of the least democratic countries that we still have in the international system. So I don't think it's going to operate through that mechanism necessarily. What is, I think, worrisome is that to the extent that the United States and China are truly decoupling and increasingly forcing countries, third countries, to choose explicitly or implicitly which supply chain they want to be part of, this does establish some of the kind of zero-sum logic that led to a lot of the worst events of the Cold War. So intervention in the Congo and the murder of the first democratically elected president of the Congo, or Zaire, Patrice Lumumba, the overthrow of Mossadegh, et cetera. So I've run out of my time. I'll stop there, and I look forward to a very robust discussion moving forward. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Cullen, for that incredibly rich, comprehensive overview. I think any one of the points that you brought up, we could, again, talk about for a whole afternoon, if not longer. But we'll move now to Sophia. who is a global distinguished professor in environmental studies and public policy at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Her research centers on the geopolitics of critical minerals, transition to net zero future, and fourth industrial revolution. She's authored several books, among which include critical minerals, the climate crisis and the tech imperium, China and the geopolitics of rare earths, and the EU, US, and China tackling climate change, et cetera. Which is to say, she also has a very broad expertise on China, EU, and US, which makes it hard to characterize and put her in only one category of national analysis. But I look very much forward to her reflections and her inputs.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And, I've been taking copious notes while everybody's been speaking, because I think that so many issues are now coming to the fore. We're questioning, what is security? What is scarcity? Where is the world going? What are our existential questions? Supposedly, this entire major transition that includes the decarbonization of the global economy and the fourth industrial revolution are all part of our response to what is the greatest threat to the global commons, which is the climate crisis. I mean, every day is the warmest day in recorded history. We're seeing, I mean, just here talking about whether or not Russia can build infrastructure when the permafrost is melting, making it unstable, let alone what it'll emit in the atmosphere. These are huge questions, and frankly, it's troublesome. I might sound a bit down today, but I want to say that the current geopolitical hyper-competition that is happening amongst the great players, which, predominantly the US and China, are absolutely unfit for the climate crisis and for the problems that we are facing. I mean, we've taken apart, we've used critical minerals. I started writing about critical minerals back in the ancient times of 2017 and 18. When I first wrote China and the Geopolitics of Rare Earths, people were saying, what are you talking about? This is a trade dispute. This is not a geopolitical issue. And I was flabbergasted that the world did not realize that one country that was a major rising industrial power had such control of the key elements for this decarbonization drive that we were already trying to achieve, but we had not entirely accepted. Today, we see that the response, I think, was so short-sighted. So many opportunities were lost then. In order to understand what it actually meant, let's put aside the fraud geopolitics. What did it mean for the entire planet to simultaneously accept a few years later that the solution is a new industrial policy to solve the climate crisis that was created by our industrial policy up until that moment? So a new industrial policy was created and generated that supposedly would solve the problem. Everybody was embarking on this at the same time, and people knew, number one, we needed so many materials, so many more materials, because these technologies now need inputs from the entire periodic table. These technologies are voracious consumers of different types of materials. So rare earths were the first flag, but now the list is very long of what we consider critical materials, including copper, which had never been considered a critical material. So I just want to say that we were ill-prepared, and at the time, there was such faith in globalization and interdependence that people sort of put it aside as soon as the prices corrected themselves and went about their business, and nothing, literally nothing happened in order to prepare us for what came next. And since then, Economists have always believed that, price will fix things, perhaps. Globalization was win-win for everyone, for consumers. It spread the wealth across the globe, and that politics was politics and economics would trump geopolitics. And now we're seeing the exact opposite, which is a truth that was always so, except we went through a period where we didn't want to believe that, especially after the end of the Cold War. So let's resituate ourselves. The die has been cast. For years, I've been saying that this US-China hyper-competition is bad for climate, certainly bad for geopolitics. I think that almost like the United States and China are like each one is like the side of the same coin. I don't know, I didn't get the expression exactly right, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of the way that the US and China view perhaps the world. For the United States had been a leader for so long because of its economic power, its control of the financial system, its deep alliances, its involvement in building international institutions, the norms, the values, democracy. This has been a country that's been very active in the way that the world operates. And for a very long time, and especially after the Cold War, there were no real challenges to that. Things were sort of evolving, but China is also a very important country, a very big power, an ancient country that has a long history and views the world in different terms. And so as it became like a rising power, it also wanted to have a say in the norms, the values, the way that the world operates. Now, it's taken a very different approach, but gradually what we see is that China is getting much more involved in international institutions, in peacekeeping, in forming different kinds of partnerships, maybe not military alliances. There's a lot of securitization and militarization going on from the part of the West, which, should be a little disturbing. But China is also building deeper partnerships, and partnerships that really create dependencies on China. And I think we got a great view of that when we heard Florian talk about the way Russia is really becoming utterly dependent on China. There will be a moment, I think, where Russia will understand, and I can imagine also the sort of the ego that's going to be involved there, as Russia had been the teacher of China, and now Russia is entirely reliant on China. And, these emotions never completely leave the table, these historical realities. We once were, you are today. But if Russia becomes really a source of just extraction and all the added value goes to China, this is a huge, this is a really important new reality. Now, one of the things that I'd like to also stress here, just thinking about things that you guys said before, is that one thing has become clear. Globalization, as we understood it, is over. Countries, including Western countries that would never utter these words, are talking industrial policy. The United States is talking industrial policy. Secretary Yellen is going around saying, we need to protect our industries. This has been unheard of in the past decades. This is very open now, and I don't know that even if there is a change in the elections in November, I think that this concept of industrial policy and is really an extension, a different kind of rendition, perhaps, certainly more climate informed, of America First, and building these sectors that are important because they are the only game in town, economic game in town. Decarbonization and the digitalization are the big new industrial policies that are, and these countries, as you mentioned, need to have an important share of the market. So all of these ideas of democracy versus autocracy, these are ideological ways of describing what's going on. They're very reminiscent of the Cold War era. They sound more noble, if you'd like, instead of saying we're really trying to sell more cars, or we're trying to sell our 5G to you, or we are trying to control, the AI and the entire tech imperium. Might I also just mention that this big fourth industrial revolution transition is very energy intensive, will also rely on critical minerals if we're decarbonizing our energy systems, and also has a lot of other sort of problematic in different ways. These are technologies that might be fantastic in some ways, but they also interfere with our freedoms, and they give rise to other questions of surveillance, of firewalls. So there are a lot of issues that come into play. So we've kind of I think we've jumbled everything together, so that we need to right now tease out what is really, really happening. So industrial policy, I think, is what's happening. It's back on the table. We need to understand that, I'm actually now beginning to even question if the way that we have said that we will be decarbonizing the global economy is going to be the entire type of transition we're trying to achieve. We're already seeing cracks in the plan. Fossil fuels are here to stay. The United States is the #1 fossil fuel producer in the world. #1. Saudi Arabia, 2. Russia, 3. The US is #1. That is a great point of leverage to have. Manufacturing is back in America also because of energy costs. So these are important things to note and to pay attention to. We're seeing cracks in the plan as the West, I think, has discovered that it's completely unprepared to produce all of these electric vehicles. This is why they're slapping on tariffs on China. The United States went from 20% to 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China. The EU waited for the European election to be over, and they slapped 38% tariffs. The US says that's not good enough. We're seeing so many issues coming into play. If we think about the trade distorting policies that have been put in place in order to defend industrial policy by all these different actors, the International Energy Agency says there are about 2,500 such new policies that are being put in place. So I guess what I really want us to think about is, I think about the future. I think about critical minerals. I've written extensively about ways forward, about ways of cooperation. There's absolutely no reason for critical minerals to be part of this, exacerbating the crisis. But the reality is, the more the time goes by, perhaps the ship has sailed. We see now that there are many ways by which the world, because of these fragile politics, is really decoupling. I think I really like the point that you made, that this talk of de-risking is really not de-risking supply chains. This is really about moving risk elsewhere or opening up new cans of worms. That there's a lot of misunderstanding about supply chains, mining, environmental impacts of all of this complete, destruction and rebuilding of our entire infrastructure systems. And I think I just want to throw in one more aspect, because I think the conversation will also guide us into, pinpointing different facts. But one of the things that is also happening, is contributing, apart from the environmental policy, the industrial policy angle, is ESG. Because we did mention the environmental impacts of all of the mining and all of the refining of the processing of these materials, a slew of materials, mostly in the developed world. There is a question of equity, inclusion, of course, but there are also huge environmental risks. Many authors and many people in the policy world have been speaking about this. ESG has been coming to the rescue. ESG standards are, again, a way by which the EU, I would just say this, the EU is the farthest along in trying to design and specify how these standards should look, so that we can all adhere to like one playbook. But I think the West is also trying to use ESG as a way to also level the playing field, because I think, as Marina said, China has a cost advantage, which it will no longer have if ESG standards are put in place. And they will also give some kind of sense of protecting the developing world, which has been, it's almost the same countries that have had previous, in which mining has been happening, that also have a lot of these critical minerals that we now all need. So I don't go on for too long, because I'd love to hear more thoughts from the audience. And we do have Andre, who's also going to kind of weave us all together. I think we are in a very precarious situation. Geopolitics will only become more and more contentious and fraught. The fact that there are 2 wars going on right now, and people are still going about their business, and the economy is still growing, and they're, the optimistic projections, the fact that the deepening ties between Russia and China are affecting more than just, trade relations, but there are developing other policies. This is all worrisome, but also completely climate and misinformed, uninformed, and an egregious global policy failure. And the world order should really be put on notice, because the idea is to help us live in more peace, prosperity, and to tackle the climate crisis. And none of this is happening right now.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I think you put a lot of things in our head about things to be concerned about, things to note. And I think we're hopefully going to be able to at least address some of those things in a little bit more depth in some shrinking time for discussion. But before we go there, please, I'd like to ask my project partner, Andre Monberger, to give his reflections, and I think also a little bit of the EU side of things. Andre is a senior lecturer in environmental and energy system studies at Lund University. His research focuses on how sustainability transitions interact with security, and he uses quite interdisciplinary approaches, scenarios, material flow analysis, and he studies how transitions can change current trade flows and dependencies. I'm just always in awe of how he mixes also the technical and the policy together in his own work. And he's also, to note, the program manager for a different Mr. project on mineral governance, in addition to his work in the Mr. Geopolitics program. So
first of all, thank you all for your presentation. This has been super interesting. It will be a bit challenging.
Andre, there's an echo. I don't know if there's a way to kind of, I'm not sure.
So, is it better now? No.
You don't hear it? Maybe if you
better now.
Maybe you might have to mute your audio.
Okay, but I will not hear you now. But does it work? Should you show with the thumbs up or down? Yeah.
It's still an echo. Okay, can you say something?
Yeah. One.
Sorry, these are online things always have the risk of technical hiccups. So I hope you guys can.
So, does it work now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, you just need to adapt when you have some issues, I guess. So thank you all. It was super interesting. It will be a bit difficult to pull all of it together, but I will try to be a bit quicker so we can have the interaction between us. So I will start by saying a few words about the EU perspectives on critical raw materials and some of the challenges that the EU is probably facing. So starting that the EU has started to identify import dependence as a problem back in 2008. And it was in the Raw Materials Initiative. And one of the things that it was supposed to do was to develop a list of critical raw materials that identified. And the first such list was issued back in 2011. And since then, it has been updated every third year. And as you can see in this figure, the number of critical raw materials has inflated and increased for each edition. And the way that EU perceives this, in the first editions at least, is mainly a combination of a material that has a high economic importance and is perceived to have a high supply risk. And high supply risk is mainly an import dependence from single countries. But then since 2023, the latest edition also included what calls strategic materials. And these are based on a foresight approach. And this meant that it changed the methodology here. And it also changed the reasons why it included some of these materials. So this foresight could be that it perceives there will be a demand-supply imbalance in the future. But it could also be that it's materials that are important for the defense sector, for example, but that do not have that high economic importance. And then in the last year, it has also launched this Critical Raw Materials Act, which I will speak more about, because the Critical Raw Materials Act in the EU is really the first time that the EU is pushing for legislation on this matter. So before, it was a bit more softer approach to regulating. And basically what happened in the early years was that the EU forced the member state to start to think about this. And it also meant that there would be some type of interactions between different areas in the government, because they needed to do some work here, preparatory work. There was also some type of changing in how research funding is allocated, because if you applied for research funding and you could show that your project was relevant for this critical raw materials, then that could increase your likelihood of getting those funding. So, but it was a bit of a light type of regulation, I should say. But that is not the case anymore, because now it comes this regulation from the EU, hard regulation, and it's really started to really moved on top of the policy agenda. And one of the things that you can see, I think, is illustrated in this picture, where President Ursula von der Leyen herself was the one who announced this new Critical Raw Materials Act. And as you can see here, what the EU is highlighting is the import dependence, and it has a couple of different materials on a couple of different countries. But the main one that is highlighted here by the EU is the import dependence from China. But there are other countries too that they bring up here. So which targets do the EU define here in its Critical Raw Materials Act? Well, it's to increase extraction. At least 10% of the consumption should come from within the EU in 2030. This may seem to be very low, but currently the EU is import dependent for quite a lot of these critical raw materials, and it has a very low mining and extraction. The EU has also defined targets for processing, so at least 40% of the consumption. So this means that you could have import of concentrates that are then processed within the EU to fulfill this. It has defined targets for recycling, at least 15% of consumption. And for some areas like battery materials, there are additional regulation here on how much that should come from recycled content in 2030, 2035, and so on. Then it has also defined targets for import dependence from single countries, maximum 65 from a single country. And there's also some targets when it comes to sustainability on reporting environmental footprint, improving circularity, and as I said previously, also with this research funding. But most of what is done when it comes to sustainability, I would say when it comes to circularity at least, is directed towards recycling. So not the other parts of circular economy like reducing the use and so on. So how will this be achieved then? Well, I have differentiated here between what is externally done and what is internally. So externally, there is legislation coming up on trade agreements, strategic partnerships, somehow similar to what is done in the US, also on monitoring markets, stress testing, and so on. The EU is also pushing for promoting free trade agreements and supporting the World Trade Organization. And historically, in the last couple of years, it has also been filing complaints when it has felt that this has not been the case. And then internally, the EU is often pushing for its internal market. But it's also forcing the member states to act here. And one of this is to have a national exploration programs. And this is something that every member states need to have in the future. The EU is also pushing for establishing value chains within the European Union. One prime example is the Battery Alliance, where the EU tried to coordinate across the value chain, from the extraction up until the recycling, and to have the control of all of this within the European Union. There is also some early preliminary work on monitoring or coordinating national strategic stocks. How this will go and how this will work in the future is highly uncertain, I would say, but there is at least plans for this. And there is and just started to give priority to strategic projects. So companies, mining companies, for example, can apply to have their project classified as strategic. And if this is considered to be strategic, there is maximum length on how long time it should take for the permitting processes, because this has been identified as one of the problems, that these are very, very, very long currently. And then also on improving sustainability and circularity of critical raw materials. But as I said, most of that focusing then on reporting, environmental footprint, and recycling. So moving on then to some of the challenges. And this is partly addressed in the legislation, I should say, but I still think it's worth emphasizing that the European Union differs quite a lot from the other countries and experience that we've heard on before, because it's not one sovereign state, but rather multipolar union. And the EU is trying to have a coordinated mechanism where each different companies and so on can report how much they need, and then the EU is supposed to aggregate this and match supply and demand and support the companies. But there is incentives here also for individual member states to go abroad and try to support their own industries. And this is what is illustrated in this picture, is when the Olaf Scholz, the head of Germany, meets his Chilean Chilean president in order to make trade agreements for the German industry to supply the German industry with the critical raw materials. And this is really a challenge, I think, for the European Union, and how to not have the different member states confront each other. And it's a bit different from the other countries. Some of the other challenges that they do raise in the new Critical Raw Material Act, but that could also be challenging, is social acceptance towards mining. There are quite a lot of projects that could be profitable, probably, within the European Union, but they are often met with fierce rejections and complaints by the local communities and other interests. And how to move forward on this and increasing the acceptance, especially when there is a call for having very rapid permitting processes in the same time. I think this will be very, very challenging to do within the European Union. Secondly, competition for skilled labor and the sector attractiveness. As I said, the European Union do not really have that much of a history of being a big mining, having a big mining sector. And the mining that we do have has mainly been on base metals like iron and so on. And there's a different type of skills required now to be developed. And the other countries will need this too. So I think that there will be a high competition for this. Further here, the impacts on resource-rich developing countries. This is an area where the new legislation is a bit vague. It says that the Union should seek mutually beneficial partnerships and that the European Union should seek to support the development of these developing countries. But at the same time, the European Union has targets for processing these critical raw materials within the European Union. So there's a risk here of locking in these developing countries in a bit of a poverty trap, which I think is something that the EU needs to consider more on really how to move forward here. And then finally, on competing values, that the EU has been pushing quite hard for multilateralism, but at the same time now it's starting to approach more and advocate more for strategic autonomy and mutual trade agreements. And I can also see a bit of a clash of interest here. And depending on how EU moves forward, it could also challenge its credibility in some of these areas, depending on which values are compromised. So that was my quick take on the Critical Raw Materials Act and the EU's responses here. And then I will say just a few short reflections, because I think, especially Sophia, you put it so nicely previously here, but some of the areas here, when it comes to decoupling and so on, I think it's interesting here to hear on the different intersection on many different policy areas that we've been touching upon. So this is not just one policy area. It is really an interaction between industry, jobs, environment, interest from the defense sector, and that the industrial policy is definitely back. Some of the challenges here, depending on what happens, is also on how these different areas are impacted. And we talked about the low carbon transition, and it was raised by several of the speakers here. If that is like the aim to have the low carbon transition, what will happen here? And I think something that we could discuss perhaps here is if this will make the low carbon transition more expensive, because we're moving away from these free trade markets with multilateralism and so on. Is it so that it will be slower, or will it have a different directionality? So perhaps having technologies that are not as efficient and so on, or more plug-in hybrids instead of electric cars and so on? Or will it actually make it impossible to have the low carbon transition that is needed? So, I mean, there's quite a lot of different things that could happen here. Another point here is also that now when it's becoming more connected to national security, then perhaps that supports mobilizing some resources and acceptance for the high cost that would otherwise not be possible. That's also something one could speculate and discuss. But I'm thinking about, Colin, with your figures that you showed here on how much that is allocated for these different ones and so on, and made in America slogan and so on. And we have similar in Europe and in China too. And perhaps this would not be possible if there wouldn't be this sense of conflict and rivalry and so on. So that's also a bit something I think could be interesting to discuss a bit. And then finally, I think it's also interesting with the different nuances that we see here on geopolitics and how it compares with the fossil fuels, and that we shouldn't replicate everything that has happened in the past. And I've heard several different examples of that there are some similarities, but also differences. So one of this was the difficulty of having restrictions and sanctioning different countries. This is something we've seen in the past, and we heard examples now from how Russia is moving more towards the east, and that has definitely been the case before too. When you have liquid markets and it's possible to shift between different suppliers, consumers, and so on, then it's very difficult to have this type of stringent trade. Sorry, can't find a word. But when you're trying to punish certain countries and so on. Then we also heard about the differences here with the resource curse, and I'm fully in agreement on that. That's on the national side, on the state level. This is probably not that much of a problem. But all of the analysis that I've seen on this has been done on the national state level. So this is also, I mean, what happens if you go down, have a more granular approach, looking on different regions where you have this mining and where different communities are impacted and so on. I think it could be a very different result there. So that is also something that could be interesting to look more deeper into, at least in forthcoming studies and so on. Then I think it was also interesting with this idea of that we're not really, or the different countries, I should say, are not de-risking, but rather changing their exposure from something similar to political leverage, energy weapon, and so on, into the risk exposure for instability in certain countries and so on. I think that was also a very interesting point here. So having said that, I should end with my reflections, and yeah, you're welcome to lead the discussion here.
Yes, you guys can all blame me for poor time management, as we only now have 15 minutes or 17 for both the discussion between us and then also Q&A. But I'm wondering if we can also kind of somewhat subsume some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A in the discussion as well. Maybe just one thing to pull out, I think also it was addressed in several presentations, but I think, Sophia, you raised it most cogently about sort of the shift from, what we used to think of as positive sum conceptualizations of security and economic security as shared, as being more efficient, as reducing costs, as increasing, basically sharing the wealth and increasing prosperity, has really changed into much more zero-sum frameworks of security, including in the mineral sectors, but not only. And I'm really wondering, when it comes to kind of the idea of security and the changing ideas of it, when it's a zero-sum concept of security, that really begs the question then, how secure is secure enough? And also security for whom? Because especially when it is a more zero-sum game, then, I mean, it comes at costs also to other players. And costs, I think, to other players and security for whom is really relevant to some of the things I wanted the discussion to be about, but also some of the questions that have been raised in the Q&A, which is, what is the impact on the developing world? I think it's not entirely clear what the impacts are, certainly for green transition, which is the shared global challenge, and climate action. I think many of the studies have said that this is quite bad. This is quite damaging in terms of the speed of transition, in terms of raising costs. But at the same time, we do need larger supply. So greater investment, even at national levels, could, for example, be part of that. I'm not able to obviously address any of those, but I know that the panelists are able to. So I wonder, first of all, if any of the panelists have questions for each other or comments for each other, or if you want to get more directly into kind of what are the implications of some of the things that you've been presenting on the rest of the world and for sustainability, not only at national levels and industrial policies at national levels and national targets, but also for the greater environment, for developing countries, for Africa, as specifically pointed out by two questions in the Q&A. So if there's anybody that wants to raise their hand or just jump on, please go ahead.
Okay, I'll jump on. I think a couple of things. The first thing is that I saw there was a question that said, you know, what role should the UN play? The UN Secretary General came out and actually talked about this issue of this green transition has to be inclusive and equitable, and we cannot leave the developing world behind. And that's part of what we're trying to accomplish, also in the name of the climate crisis and because of the climate crisis. So he has convened, he created a panel on critical minerals. There are 23 countries there, including the African Union, the EU, but also the US and China. So there is hope that at least at the UN level, there's a conversation that's beginning, that's more robust. Everybody's realizing or has to accept that not enough is either said or done or thought about how the developing world will adjust to decarbonize itself, to not become an extractive pit, to have all of the problems and none of the benefits. But there are also other working groups within the UN that have been working on mining and critical minerals. Some of the solutions out there are ESG. I spoke about that. I think ESG standards are going to be very helpful for the developing world. I think the projects like Global Gateway that the EU has launched, almost, I would say, in competition with the Belt and Road Initiative, these are projects that at least, you know, will bring in, like Global Gateway will bring in very, I think, clear standards for extraction and processing and development and labor issues. Definitely the Belt and Road, for all of the criticism, is China has an incredible adaptability, and that when it sees like an overwhelming critique in some area, then it goes back and tries to fix the problems that arise with new standards, with new kinds of partnerships. It's greening the Belt and Road, or so it's being said. Then I think the African Union for Africa should and must play a very important role, because African countries now have much more agency, and I'll focus on Africa specifically, than they did before. I think the African Union has become a rising and reliable partner. There is also an Africa plan for how they envision this transition. So I definitely think for the EU in particular, because the EU is the closest kept ties, very close bonds with Africa. The United States really checked out after the Cold War, but is trying to make a comeback there. China, of course, we know has been, since Tiananmen, has been boosting its ties with Africa. So having a EU-China Africa tripartite dialogue, which exists on paper, I think will be very important here. These are some of my initial, I guess, thoughts. And we're seeing that a lot of governments now, even in the Congo, they're renegotiating certain kinds of contracts that they had with China in particular, but I think with other major powers as well. They're trying not to miss this opportunity to build their economies and protect the environment. This is something very important that is being overshadowed. And my hope is that ESG in particular will sort of rein it in, and smart mining practices as well.
Maybe just on that point, we can bring in Cullen, because there have been specific questions to you related to Africa. But I think this is very relevant, I think, to all the panelists, because if it is becoming a battleground for geopolitical influence, as playing out also in the mineral sector, I think what kind of fallout can we expect? I mean, is this good or bad? Is the competition, sort of giving Africans more options, giving them renegotiating power, or is this, in the case of some, competing models and Russian offers of regime stability, is that also damaging in some ways, possibly?
Sure, lots of territory to cover there. I mean, I think that you're right to frame it that way, and that we've been talking about kind of this increasing engagement with, say, Africa, though I'll expand the aperture to talk about a lot of the developing and middle income world here in a moment. We've been focusing on this kind of geopolitical narrative and this framing around a scramble. Okay, that could be horribly negative, as we saw in the 19th and 20th centuries. That could also actually, I think, be positive, in part because I think that on the one hand, you are establishing conditions under which Western firms backed by Western governments, and I think a significant internalization of a lot of the ESG kind of considerations into their investment models and their pitch, are moving into a market where previously they were not competing. They were essentially allowing Chinese firms to do the spade work, so to speak, to develop this kind of the mining capacity, especially in Africa, for export, for processing. So I think that there's an opportunity there actually to play off multiple competitors in order to bid up sort of the kind of concessions that developing and middle income countries can claw out of investing major powers. At the same time, too, there's now a playbook that's been established by Indonesia, and I think there are reasons why Indonesia's model might not be exportable to the extent that many developing and middle income countries think there is, but Indonesia successfully downstreamed and moved into the processing stage of nickel in particular via export bans. And that's actually been a policy that I think has been mimicked much more so than I think the previous round of resource nationalism that we saw around resource booms, which focused much more on state ownership. Here, I think the emphasis is less on state ownership, although there is some of that. So we now have Litio MX, which is the Mexican national lithium firm. So there is some level of state ownership. But increasingly, it has to do with putting up barriers for the export of raw material in order to encourage investment in downstream processing, because that constitutes a significant value add over the value of just the ore itself. Of course, when you're doing that, though, you have to take into account that mineral processing is incredibly energy intensive. It's sort of an order of magnitude more intensive than actually mining the rock, which isn't exactly an efficient process to begin with. And so if that's not able if the energy for those kind of processing facilities is not able to come from renewable sources, then we're maybe taking 2 steps back to take 1 step forward. And so I think that there are a variety of challenges that we have already covered related to political economy, but another one has to do with expanding energy infrastructure. At the same time, this program of competitive subsidization is driving down final consumer costs significantly for precisely the kind of things that you will need: photovoltaic arrays, modules, et cetera, for transitioning to renewable energy infrastructure at a much lower cost than would have even obtained just several years ago. I'll stop there. You are muted.
Yeah, mute.
Right. Yes, I was gonna also ask maybe Marina or Florian if you also have comments on kind of the geopolitical competition side of it, as it's spilling over to other parts of the world where, either China is established or, the Russia is also trying to come in, all these kinds of things as they play out for the rest of the world. Do you see this kind of battleground for the rest of the world? And is it net positive or negative in what aspects for countries in Africa or elsewhere?
Oh, generally, Global South has been on China's radar for critical minerals. China has invested quite extensively in securing some of the strategic mines in Africa, and promised to invest in infrastructure and technology transfer. And when we're talking about Africa, we're sort of taking the position from the supplier side, and we're sort of considering them as passive recipients of investment money or whatever, just extracting the minus from them. But actually, if you take the position from them, they obviously, as Colin said, not part of free trade agreement countries with the US, or at least not entirely in the group of like-minded groups with the US. So they have very immediate concerns in terms of their deposits of critical minerals to make money, to improve the poverty of the countries and their people. So in this sense, China actually has at least promised to help them realize those immediate goals, including extracting, mining in a more environmentally friendly way. So those countries actually are one very important stakeholders in the global value chain of critical minerals. And I totally agree with Sophia. And lift the boss of ESG actually will perhaps help not just technology suppliers, but also users. So that will push countries such as China in the multilateral partnership to use, for example, more cleaner electricities in the mining, in the processing, and on the other hand, helping those countries to develop to improve the infrastructure. Let's say, China is having this overcapacity of solar panels and those renewable energy technologies, and they can help those countries to make a transition. So using solar energy, solar electricity in the mining. So that is not, those two things are not exclusive. And if partnerships can be built, that is not going to be zero-sum game.
Great. Florian, if you want to also make a comment on that.
Yes, yes, thank you. In terms of course, geopolitical battleground, what we are seeing, of course, not only in Africa, but as well in Latin America, is interesting case of things are moving. If we take, for example, Bolivia, we saw that there is an ongoing discussion, cooperation between the Bolivian government and Rosatom, the uranium company, and as well the Chinese, in order to exploit these lithium things. And in the same time, now in Argentina, you have this new president, Javier Milei, in which is more friendly with the Western country, which is like trying to attract new investors, like Western mining countries, like European countries, the US, to come and exploit this mineral potential that actually Argentina has, and it has been largely undeveloped. So you have this this is moving. I mean, of course, according of the in each country there is a specific movement. We see in Africa, in which you have this regime change, in which African countries are more mining and close to BRICS. So you have all this global geopolitical influence battle, in which, of course, China and Russia and all this BRICS plus system, which of course it means it's more systemic. It's not, of course, not only the critical minerals, but critical minerals, I mean, fall in this layer, in which it is part of this securing some sort of minerals, but as well because this mineral, of course, will allow to secure these technologies for defense industry, for clean tech technologies, but as well all about this high technology related to artificial intelligence, and you have all these quantum computers. All that stuff you need all the critical minerals. So of course, the pressure on this will just keep up for sure.
Great, thank you so much. I just want to ask a quick question. Based on the Q&A, there's actually, I think, more than one question about deep sea mining. If anybody wants to come in very quickly with the perspective of some of the developments there. I know one of them was directed towards Marina, but I think, Sophia, you also want to come in quickly. Yeah.
I'll just say that for me, it's a bad idea, but it seems as if it's going to go forward. The question is, how will we monitor it? What kinds of standards? I think we need to, I mean, there are always excuses for doing that. We're also looking into space mining. There are many different ways that we're looking for materials, but I think we need to really solve the problems we've already created before we start an untested new technology.
I agree with Sophia. I mean, I barely trust the Norwegians to get this right. And if I barely trust the Norwegians to get it right, that means I have grim prospects for the rest of the world to do this in a way that doesn't destroy vastly important ecosystems. That's it from me.
Thank you. And Marina, I think that the original question was actually about China and deep sea mining, if you have.
Well, China does have deep sea mining ambitions, and these ambitions are driven by several, by a combination of factors. Resource security is one of the reasons, especially in the current geopolitical environment, and also is kind of China's technological forecast of developing their technological advantages in the new areas. Just like, 10 years ago, nobody was talking about, well, I mean, some of the mineral processing technologies, actually, several countries, Japan, US included, they didn't want it because environmental costs were too high, and China took it. And China now is thinking, okay, we might just find another trajectory where we can build our advantages. So that's one of the driving forces. And the third one, obviously, is the geopolitical tensions. And in the end, I think, we're in this very dangerous zone of zero-sum game in terms of countries are fighting for not just the minerals, because the minerals, as I said, they're not scarce, especially the new ways of finding, identifying, discovering new sites all the time. So in the long run, in a dynamic environment, that may not be the case. But the case is countries using industrial policies, not just to fix market failures or systems failures, but to pursue some strategic targets, such as stockpiling critical minerals, secure mining critical mines resources. So this is not going to help, as several of us mentioned tonight, well, in your daytime, it's not going to save our planet. And I agree with Cullen. Before any technology has been discussed globally, before any multilateral collaborations or standards have been established, this new thing, finding minerals in deep sea or outer space should be very, should slow down, just like AI.
Okay, there are, thank you. There are so many questions. Some of them are just in and of themselves a great presentation kind of points and topics. Unfortunately, not much time to address them. But I think some of the things that we're ending on, I think really get at the heart of some of the contradictions, that the trade-offs, the different competing imperatives that are really at play and at work here. And I think one of the, maybe it's a bit simplistic, but framed in terms of a race to the bottom or race to the top, shifting the risk or distributing the risk more equally, diversifying. I think all these things are incredibly complex. I think it's not really quite possible to even scratch the surface in a 2-hour time frame. But I hope that for the audience and for also the panelists that you got some takeaway from that. I got a lot. I need to go back through what is the recording, and for everyone to know that this will be also posted online in the coming weeks. If you need to revisit some of those slides, which I will do myself. I will ask also the panelists if you have any urgent questions or statements. This is also a good time for you to have any closing comments.
No, just thank you so much for convening. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great honor to join the panel.
I just want to thank all of you for being with us today. I think especially our distinguished panelists, but also Andre for giving the reflections. And I also want to give a major shout out to the events team and Martina and Lucas for helping me to set all these things up. Thank you all so much for joining us, and hopefully we see you again at another SIPRI webinar. So.